Hello and welcome to Addiction Recovery Revolution. I'm your host, Debbie Nelson, and I'm pleased to introduce Lyle Murphy. He is the founder of Alternative to Med Center in Sedona, and I absolutely adore the work that this man has done. Welcome, Lyle.
No, thank you, Debbie. It's always been really a reward for me to be able to gain audience with you. You have such a live spirit and such a passion that wow, I wish I would have come across folks like you a decade ago when I first started this thing. It was quite a barren field trying to find anyone that would, embrace the notion that maybe psychiatry and medications were poisoning people and that there was potentially a better way. And over the last decade or 12 years, it's been since I opened Alternative to Meds, the awareness and the information and just how people view health has shifted dramatically. I mean, 12 years ago, there was not many people who could embrace that your brain was also part of your body. And all the information that was out there about, how your cardiovascular system would improve if you added fish oils or vitamin E or all that stuff, none of that sort of alternative approach was being applied to mental health. The brain is still part of our body, and whatever is feeding our body is also feeding our brain. And that there was a few folks out there like Richard Kenyon, who's currently the president of the Orthomolecular Health Society, Carl Pfeiffer, Dr. Michael Lesser, other folks that had started this orthomolecular sort of platform. And then there was a CCHR, which was putting out some very inflammatory sort of material regarding psychiatry. And that was pretty much it. So that was the altars that were available to us to share. And when we started this, I know I've talked about it before, but the way I came to this was in 95, after graduating from chiropractic school, I had neglected my own health so much to be able to, which is what happens to lawyers and medical doctors. It's that internship and the stuff they put you through. They're intentionally going to see if you crack. They're going to stress you out to the point where you're going to start showing signs of weakness. And if you're living off of top ramen and your own fight or flight, you're eventually going to cave in. And I was paying my own tuition, and it was $4,000 every 10 weeks when the minimum wage was $3 an hour.
Wow.
Over 70 hours of my time was dedicated to school. Even though I was only taking 25 class hours, there was at least another hour and a half that had to be dedicated to studying and boards and seeing patients. And, it was a lot. So I started having spiritual awakenings that I didn't have any grounding for. I didn't have anyone to talk to about. And that escalated at some point into psychosis. And what it really was is I wasn't eating. I was a literally starving student. And I got picked up by the police sitting in a car that was identical to the car I was supposed to be sitting in, a little gray Honda hatchback Ford. And they took me out to jail, charged me with unoccupied burglary. At that point, I thought I was in a ride, on a UFO or gotten mopped up by special ops or whatever. It just was, I didn't do anything wrong, so I didn't even consider I was going to jail. And then when they got me to jail, they're doing an intake, and I'm so sad. I have no explanation for this depth of sadness. And so my last coherent request was to ask for a blood sugar test. And it was 39. It was, usually you can go a little lower than that before you drop into a coma. But the nurse was freaked out. She went to go get another glucometer, confirmed that, the first one wasn't broken. And she's like, oh my God, I need to get you a sandwich or something. And once she left, the guards just moved me into a cell. And I pulled the sheet up over me on the floor. And that's the last thing I remember for 2 weeks. And when I woke up 2 weeks later, there was a brief moment of clarity where I'm realizing that it was next year. By that time, it was 1996. It was over the holidays. And then I realized it had only been 2 weeks. And I'm like, I'm waiting for, like, when you wake up in someone's house, you don't know where you are. You kind of, if you sit with it, you'll figure it out. But I'm waiting for this moment for it to make sense. And after a very quiet space, nothing entered into make sense of where that last 2 weeks went. And then there's this crashing and all the beep, 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 beep of the pulse oximeters I'd gotten untied from the gurney I was in. And I basically lived in a disabled state for 10 years where I had to learn how to talk, walk, and overcome basically a stroke. And most of my more, noticeable deficits like speaking and articulating and walking, we covered in about 3 weeks. But my ability to hold short-term memory and my ability to be able to have energy. I had a lot of passion, a lot of juice in my motor. And whatever I experienced, adrenal fatigue or whatever, I found myself sleeping 20 hours a day for the first year. And after 5 years, maybe was sleeping 16 hours a day. And whatever time I was awake, I was not really awake. I couldn't even tell a story and have it make sense because I would forget what I was talking about in the middle of the story. I couldn't, I was so disabled I couldn't even get on disability, right? And then after 10 years, I did I volunteered at this drug program that had they had a lot of supplements and a lot of nutraceutical ways of helping people. They just said, well, you're volunteering here, you might as well do this thing. And it popped me out of it. It was very miraculous. And I've never since then seen someone have that dramatic of a turnaround. There's no real justification for why I should have recovered from something that was that. If you've had a stroke, you get pretty much half of whatever you're going to get back in the first month. And then you can hope to get a little bit more back later. But if you're still really messed up after a month, you're probably going to still be really messed up for the rest of your life. And that's where I was sitting, was in a place of I had reached a plateau in my own healing. And all of a sudden, just to be popped out of it and like be awake and aware and back to having the ability to be a doctor was like, well, thank God, thank God. And I wrestled with, I've lost the last 10 years and how heartbreaking that was to have missed, normal markers of being in a relationship and getting married and having kids and all that stuff. But at least I didn't have to sacrifice the next 10 years to be in the same place. So I chose to integrate that as being just a beautiful experience. And that led me into helping other people. And it has been a learning curve that has been almost straight up. I would say much more of a experiential learning than what an outpatient doctor would get. Because an outpatient doctor is only seeing a very small window into a person's life, and they may be even lying to their doctor. Oh, I'm not drinking, or I'm not using drugs, or whatever. And so you have labs, you have some other tools, but when you're living with people and you're watching their healing experience, you get to learn what's working and what's not. And so there was nothing within the CCHR which was helpful. Those folks and the Scientologists and stuff, they to them, anybody that was damaged by psychiatry was psychiatry's problem, and they were church. They would disqualify anybody that had those experiences. And it's probably good because, walking into that kind of paradigm and that kind of dogma is its own, it's its own deception. It's its own, you're buying into a whole paradigm that doesn't fit a lot of people. And so the orthomolecular path was a path that we said, okay, these people have been working with mental health with nutrients, and let's, let's try that stuff on. And most of that stuff didn't work. And we put it to the test of truth, and replacing drugs with supplements was about 25% effective. And which was great, considering I was working with what I would still to this day deem as being schizophrenic. I don't believe in diag nonsense, but when someone has been suffering from, their reality's been very different than other people's for a decade, and they haven't had any sort of bright moments in there, then having someone like that pop out of it is remarkable. So even a 25% success rate with this population was very encouraging, but we were still missing 75% of the people. And at the time, we were applying amino acids. We were using minerals. Carl Pfeiffer talked about the zinc and the copper imbalance, and we were straight down the line. We had an orthomolecular doctor, Michael Lesser, who was one of the founding members of the Orthomolecular Health Society, along with Cunyon and Pfeiffer and a handful of other folks. And some of the stuff worked fantastically. Like niacin and vitamin C was very effective at bringing someone that was having a delusional state out of the rafters to a place where you could actually work with them. And it's still something that we use as a modality today. But what I had to come to the truth of was that, and just, when you're searching for answers, it's just a hypothesis that you put out there as being like, we're going to test this. People that were doing detox, people that actually were addressing neurotoxins on a physiological level were having a marked better integration of the supplements than the people who weren't. And that was a trail of breadcrumbs that I could follow. So I went out and got a postdoctorate in environmental medicine. For those who, postdoctorate sort of a loose term, really. It just means something that you can get certified in after you're already a doctor. You can't sit for that kind of certification unless you already have a doctorate in a practicing medicine. And they gave me a little bit of variance because I never did get licensed as a chiropractor, but the fact that I graduated and that I was using other doctors to do the doctoring for our patients, they let me sit and get certified in it. But I learned a lot about environmental medicine and a lot about how to detox people, a lot about genetic polymorphisms, which means we have, our liver has the ability to have 57 different detoxification pathways in total. And if we got that ability from mom and from dad, then we're considered normal. If we got half of it from dad and didn't get it from mom, or either way, we didn't get it from one parent, then we have a diminished ability to be able to detox in that pathway. And then if we didn't get it from either parent, then we have a compromise on that level. So basically that applies to nutrients, to toxins, everything. And it's obvious, and the orthomolecular people talk about this, and fundamentally they're right, that it really is the molecular environment that determines the health of the brain. And that includes toxins. If we have an inability to clear mercury or heavy metals or pesticides or things that are more obvious, like there's certain genotypes which cannot handle alcohol. If they have an impairment on what's called the CYP2E1, like Native Americans, Asians, then they have a really different reaction to alcohol than most people. They get flushing, and they can even have an allergic response where you see a pretty outrageous shift in their personality. And you can get addicted to your own endorphins, which are pain chemicals that come out to help, because anytime you're having an allergic response, there's inflammation, and that inflammation would hurt. So you get a release of pain chemicals, and those are very addictive too. So all of that applies to everything else too. How we can process antidepressants, how we can process polyaromatic hydrocarbons like smoking, like smog, like charcoal meats. And so if you don't have the ability to clear certain toxins, then it creates a body burden, and that body burden will break you down in a very characteristic way. And so that is, that's been more or less the playground now that we've been working with. And genetic, like the 23andMe or any of the Genomine stuff that shows you kind of the roadmap of how you will, of your detoxification and whether you have the enzymes to break down things or not. It's only a guide. It's only a set of probabilities, and it may or may not be operative in that particular person. It's sort of like getting a spot shot. You don't get the whole Google map, but you get kind of like little pieces of roads and stuff, and you can kind of in the composite put together where you might have a traffic jam if you have, it's rush hour.
Your center, Lyle, I mean, you've brought and had some huge, profound differences. I mean, with the work that you've done, and many times people get to your center and it's pretty much like they've done everything else. Their family doesn't know what else to do. And sometimes it's been that you've found, because you have an example on your actual website of a woman who came in who had such high level toxins that it had done, mental health issues. And I think that's a component that most people don't want to accept. And yet we have an epidemic of people suffering from anxiety. And I say that so much of our mental health issues are what fuel the addiction. We don't really get to the root of it. And that's really what we were talking about with the brain health, is that I think so much of it fuels the addiction. So you have, there was a woman that had, was it mercury?
Yeah, when I started going down the road of poisoning, I was operating off the hypothesis that if you have a poisoned biochemical pathway, it doesn't really matter how much amino acid you put in there. You're not going to get the neurotransmitter that is the product of that pathway. Like, for instance, tryptophan goes on to make serotonin. And there's chemical steps in there. Well, if you've got poisoning in there, it doesn't really matter how much tryptophan you add to someone's supplement protocol, you're not going to get serotonin. Just like if you have carbon monoxide in a room, it doesn't matter how much oxygen you have in that room, and there's still plenty of oxygen. That carbon monoxide is going to outcompete on a physiological level the oxygen. It's going to bind to the hemoglobin so that when your red blood cells pick it up, they're not going to let it go on a tissue level like they do oxygen. And the person is going to go into oxygen starvation and die. And that sort of premise, when I started applying it to mental health and to some of the orthomolecular stuff and some of the stuff that at the time there were a lot of proponents of amino acid therapy, which you would get some very, very amazing responses from that. But there also were a lot of people that didn't get anything from it. And to see that in a residential setting, where all the variables, the interactions they're having with their family and what they're eating and everything, you can isolate more pristinely what's going on. And let's see, what was the lab? Genova lab testing had come out with this citric acid cycle, which is the Krebs cycle, how we metabolize energy. And they showed all of the different cofactors that were necessary to make those reactions work. They also put some inhibitors, metals. And they said, well, if you have mercury here, and it's going to impair that pathway, and you can actually see a bottlenecking of a buildup of one of those steps. The pyruvic acid would back up, and you're like, holy shit, And you could give people the magnesium and all the cofactors that were necessary, and it would just, in true clinical experience, you would see that it wasn't working. So that got me on a path of saying, well, we have to unpoison people before any of these supplements or anything is really going to work. And I lost a few friends along the way that were highly attached to their pet theories about amino acids, and embarked on this completely unknown of how to unpoison them. And the truth is that in our society, we are being exposed to an unprecedented level of chemical poisons that were not part of our grandparents' experience. You either have the genetics to deal with that or you don't. Some people can break down marijuana, and the people that can't are going psychotic. Some people can biotransform pesticides, and other people can't. We have a video on our website that is, it's on the YouTube channel actually. It's in the toxicity and wellness series, but there's this grasshopper that you see that's been poisoned by organophosphates. And how they work is they kick out the nervous system, the regulatory part of the nervous system for the grasshopper, and it goes into overstimulation and dies. It poisons an enzyme called acetylcholine esterase, so that the stimulatory acetylcholine that has opened up the nerve channel and has allowed for depolarization and therefore stimulation to the brain can't get shut off. And surprise, surprise, we use acetylcholine in our nervous system, and we use acetylcholine esterase to pull it off. Now, the difference between us and an insect is that we have a liver that can break stuff down, but if our liver doesn't have the enzymes to break that down, then we actually get the same result as the grasshopper. And being circumspect enough to really withhold your own pet agenda from what's happening, there are people who are experiencing anxiety that comes and goes, and there are people that are experiencing anxiety that is there when they wake up, when they go to sleep, even in their dreams. It's like a background roar in their nervous system. Those people, it's not a psychological or a spiritual or a social thing. It's a poisoning. Your nervous system has been poisoned, and you can't realistically expect this person to be able to regulate their nervous system using tools that might work for this other person that's experiencing anxiety, you know, because a dog's barking, or because they're going out on a date, or because, you know, whatever. These folks that are experiencing it all the time, meditation tools, calming techniques, I mean, that can help, but it's not going to shift unless they start unpoisoning themselves. And we noticed that we could apply a lot of amino acids. I mean, I did 3 years worth of, you know, some of my mentors were very attached to GABA. I never saw GABA one time, even 16 GABA a day, work on this person ever, not once in 3 years. And you have to step back and go, well, wait a minute. This stuff that's being touted out there is not complete. When we started, there's all poisons have to be biotransformed out of the body. Anything that's going to stick in the body has a mechanism of how it sticks. Organic poisons, such as organophosphates or carbamates or pesticides or flame retardants or solvents, or, you know, they have a fat solubility or tissue solubility where they can hang out with other fats. And every cell membrane of our entire body, every cell has a membrane that's a phospholipid. That's one great place for this stuff to hide out. And it's reasonably sequestered in those areas. In order to get it out, it has to be biotransformed. We have to be able to pee it out. That's how we get stuff out. We sweat it out, we cry it out, we pee it out. But any of those ways is water soluble. And just like transforming a fat, you have to heat it up a bit, convert it into a calorie to lose fat, right? You don't just sit in the sauna and sweat out your fat. It has to turn to water. So that biotransformation process is very genetically driven, and it's also driven by things that you can put into the body to assist it. Methylation components, sulfonation components, any sort of thing that you can join to that to make it in a water-soluble form so you can urinate it out. And this is the mechanism behind some techniques that have been used to biotransform these out. And you also can make something that's a lot more poisonous and a lot more toxic in doing so. Niacin's a great way to ramp up some of this stuff. But in some people, you're going to make a much more reactive species that can actually be harmful. And if you try to detox people too fast, you can overwhelm them and hurt them. It's kind of like you have these criminal toxins locked away in a jail somewhere. They're not being too intrusive to society, but they're costing taxpayers. It has a detriment. But adding a reactive species to them so that they can bind to something to become water soluble is like giving them a gun and turning them loose in society. You know, then they'll do some damage and you shoot them and then you get rid of them. But on a molecular level, you have to be very circumspect as to how a person's there's two phases to it. There's phase one, which is bioactivation, and there's phase two, which is conjugation. One, the bioactivation activates it, makes it charged so that it will grab something, and it can actually do damage to DNA in those places. And then you neutralize it with a conjugator. If a person genetically is not producing enough conjugators, they're not able to methylate or sulfonate, then you have to get that phase two ramped up and equalize them out so those poisons go all the way out without harming the person. That's one very ridiculously complex, very biochemically unique application of healing. And then there's dealing with metals. Metals are polarized. They have a charge, like mercury has a +2 charge. It'll bind to a negatively charged tissue, which is, basically cell membranes and receptors and all that stuff. And mercury is the most potent poison, the most potent organic poison in our world. For anybody, any credentialed medical or dental body to embrace that adding mercury to your fillings was a good idea is protecting their own asses, because mercury has the ability to absolutely denigrate your nervous system. There's a video, it's also on the YouTube channel, that is a mercury in Calgary in Canada. They took an electron microscope and they showed what happens when you put 10 to the -7. I think that's a billion. And the EPA said you can have twice as much of that concentration in your body and it's still safe. You took half the EPA standard, 1 to the 10 to the -7 concentration of mercury, and put it in the presence of a snail axon, and watched what happened. They had a time counter going on back, and this thing just completely disintegrated. And this is what it does to our brains. I mean, we have the same basic chemical makeup in our nervous system as a snail does in their nervous system. What poison metals do is, and what makes them so ominous to our physiology is that those attractive mechanisms, like to make the structure of a nerve. I don't know if you can see my hands, but imagine like a tube, right? This is your nerve. There are fibers inside of that are like 2x4s, holding the structure of that nerve together. Those fibers are called tubulin fibers. Each one of those molecules has to attach in a linear sense in order to make a long axon or dendrite. What they use for nails are basically chemical magnets that allow them to link up. Mercury reverses the polarity of that so that they can't line up. They actually repel by each other. And it's like pulling all the 2x4s out of your house. I mean, it would fall apart, right? If pulling all the nails out, it would just...
Right.
And to continue to champion that is okay to put that far away from your brain. I mean, Hal Huggins, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's a dentist who really, really championed the failings of the American Dental Association to notice how people are being destroyed by having mercury fillings. They took his license away in '96, and he continued to hold on to what's true and talk about this stuff. And it filters down to people like me who are seeing the same stuff. So people were coming in, and they had sort of a history that had some very key features that were consistent. They had a mouthful of mercury fillings. They had anxiety, inability to sleep, and would obsess, ruminate. And if you see enough of those and you go, huh, and it's constant, it's not intermittent, it's not like situational, you have to think, well, what's the poison And we would chelate people. We would use DMSA or DMPS to go in there and grab mercury. EDTA won't do it. EDTA is not mercury is not its favorite metal to join to. So DMPS, DMSA, or DMSO will go in there and grab mercury, and it takes time for most people to unburden them enough to where their nervous system comes online again, and not just their nervous system, but how they're manufacturing neurochemicals. Serotonin is kind of the anti-rumination neurochemical. It's not an antidepressant. It doesn't give you a lift. It's not dopamine. Dopamine is like cocaine. It's an antidepressant. Serotonin will keep a person from killing themselves because it will, that impulsivity that I have to do something right now, it dampens it, and that's why they use it in antidepressants to assist people in not acting on those impulses. And antidepressants for most people are very effective, at least temporarily, jacking up their serotonin, but it comes at a cost. It's not sustainable. Just like the cocaine doesn't sustainably produce dopamine. Eventually, no amount of cocaine will give you that same effect. But it's the same way with serotonin for most people. It's a little more nuanced than that, but it's spending what's there. It's not creating it. Only tryptophan is the precursor, and 5-HTP are precursors to serotonin. And you're not adding that. And you're using something to reuptake it. Well, what happens when serotonin is forced to stay out there in the synapse? It will degrade into its metabolites and be broken down. And the receptors become numb to it. They downregulate. You get less receptors. So the application of antidepressants, not for everybody, but for many people, is not sustainable. It's short-lived, and at best, therapeutically is a temporary intervention to get them through a crisis. But that has been completely, the theory that when Prozac came out, that you have a chemical imbalance. They threw that out there in the American public through Time magazine and other journals. And then they found out it wasn't true in the 80s, and they didn't put out a similar publication saying that, well, you were wrong about this brain chemical theory, and it is really a bunch of bullshit. That never got disseminated in the same way. Whitaker talks a lot about this, Bob Whitaker. If you read his Anatomy of an Epidemic and other books he's put out about psychiatry, really even-handed journalistic approach to how we got to believe that these drugs were actually curative towards mental health problems. And so, we were doing chelation on people that had this sort of profile, that they couldn't sleep because serotonin actually goes on to make melatonin. So melatonin is the end product, really, of serotonin in the brain. And you can't just take melatonin and have it cross the blood-brain barrier. It's got to degrade all the way into tryptophan and run this pathway. And if it's broken, people aren't going to get to sleep on melatonin. It ain't going to work. It works for most people, but the people that are poisoned, it's actually a good litmus test to figure out if that pathway is poisoned. If you take melatonin and you don't get anything out of it, there's a good chance that pathway is poisoned or is genetically not working. And when we cleared people's mercury out, they would get relief from this, and the supplements started working. So that was the approach we started taking with all people, is to just go after some metals, biotransform these organic toxins out of people. And, I was out lecturing about this, and there was a fellow that used to show up. I was on a mercury-free dentist panel. I was the only non-dentist on this panel. There was 3 dentists, and they were holistic dentists, and they would talk about all sorts of things they'd seen in practice. And this one fellow by the name of Hal Huggins used to come and heckle us, basically, because this is really the patriarch of the anti-mercury movement, way back from the 70s. He died in 2016, but he'd politely heckle. He'd be like, "Well, what about this?" And I'd say, "Well, you probably know more about that than us," and he would get a chance to speak. He would talk about how the mercury itself wasn't just a poison to these pathways into the brain, but it would sit on acupuncture points and would affect the person through a mechanism I'm not familiar with, through meridians and such. And I kind of put it in that place of, well, sounds true, but I don't have any experience with it. And then this one woman came to us. Her name was Lynette. She doesn't mind. Her story is very public. It's on also our YouTube channel. And she couldn't do anything but cry. And it wasn't just crying, it was wailing. She couldn't eat. She couldn't sleep. She would bend over and she would just wail. And her husband told me this was a recent occurrence, that she wasn't a broken person through the course of their marriage. He was he owned a laboratory, and he literally was producing tests to for doctors to diagnose their patients. And we started treating her for a while, which was she couldn't eat, couldn't take supplements, she couldn't do any of the program really. And at some point I had to say to him, look, I don't know what to offer you. I had to be clear with him and be very informed in get informed consent from him that I have no idea. I'm in totally uncharted territory with your wife, and I think you should take her home and try something else, because I can't treat her, and she can't eat. How am I going to give her anything that's going to be part of our treatment plan? And he says, Lyle, I totally understand that. He says, it's either here or it's a hospital. If she can't make it here, she's going to have to go to a psychiatric hospital. And I know what that entails. I just, okay, as long as you understand that she could die here. And the reality of that. And 45 days later, she was still wailing and crying. Thank God it was over Christmas, because there's no way I could have treated her at a house full of people. It was, there was enough space in the house over Christmas and few enough people where I could more or less dampen her wailing and effect that would have on other people. And we were just throwing darts at the board, and I knew we had to go after this mercury thing, so we got her teeth handled, fell her down in Phoenix. I have to. He's actually phenomenal. I sometimes have a hard time recalling names, but starts with an M. Margolis, Dr. Margolis down in Phoenix. She went down there and got her mercury out of her teeth. She had a magnesium chloride enema that week, and she also got an acupuncture, a laser acupuncture treatment. And I came back to the center fully expecting to, Christmas was horrible. She literally wailed right through Christmas anyways. So crazy. And I came in, and she's out playing ping pong with one of our care managers. And I'm like, I'm like seeing some ghost, and I look and watch, and she's actually smiling and happy. And I figured it was a blip on the radar that she probably would go back into being that symptomatic. And it was encouraging. It was definitely encouraging. Those windows of light, reference points that you can get back to. But she never went back. I mean, it was still a long haul for her to get out of that place, but she had an immediate effect. And the most probable cause of it was the mercury and getting those fillings out. And I have now seen that instantaneous effect of getting people's mercury fillings out probably 7 or 8 more times. And I don't have a mechanism. It's merely an observation, and at some point, if I'm sharp enough, the truth will reveal itself on what the mechanism really is. But
I think that's what's refreshing with you, is just because I wonder how many people run around kind of not knowing. They feel as if it truly, and never do they connect that it could be poisoning. And, and especially if they've tried other forms, even holistic, and they're like, well, nothing's working. Well, it makes sense that really you have to start with the cleansing and detoxing yourself from that which is poisoning you before any of the rest of it is effective.
Yeah, and I'd had a lot of time on the mat with unpoisoning people from mercury and having a similar effect. But it was a slow, it was a slow unpoisoning. It was a slow unburdening of the nervous system.
Right.
And that is, it's very structural, very 3D, physical, like makes sense to an engineering mind, how that would work. I mean, people have to unburden their nervous system. And you would think just because somebody gets their fillings out, well, great, they're not leaching these poisons out into their system anymore, but whatever's in their nervous system is still affecting them. And you have to get some traction there before a person gets relieved. I mean, to see this woman go from death's door to out holding her head up, I mean, she would walk around the community like she was walking down Rodeo Drive and you know, shopping at Saks or something. I mean, she just had a complete transformation. And I stood in disbelief that it could possibly be sustainable. And it's been 5 or 6 years now, and she's not looked back for a minute.
I think we'll put a link to this video that's going out there with the link for Lynette's story, because you've got that linked onto Alternative to Meds. I mean, it's one of your, you know, many success stories of people. And, you know, I've always said, like, Alternative to Meds, you try to get to the root of all, you know, whether or not, like you say, when people come in, you don't know until you start assessing them individually to try to help them. Now, you know.
And that same person, you know, Lynette was, she was very much wanting to get better. If you took that same person and they had disbelief in higher power or God or connection with family or anything that kept them sort of in this domain and having belief, you know, and not being nihilistic, you'd probably have to treat that first, because of course they're not going to embrace any sort of physical modalities at all. And that's where you really have an advantage when you're working with people residential. If you're patient enough to listen to the physical components, the psychological components, the spiritual components, and know which layer to start working into first, then the next card that comes up will, you might be able to see the poison. They have a trauma-informed, you know, psychology. They sort of divert everything to being the worst possible way of interpreting something, and they have no belief in God. Which one's the most potent? Which one's closest to the surface? That's usually where you have to invest yourself. And if what you're doing is not working as a therapist or as a doctor, to notice it, to give them permission around that experience that they're having, and to shift into something else. And one of the I've been humbled many times in many ways, but I'm now at the place where more or less I believe that the patient is the authority, that they are the truth of whatever's going on with them. And there's probably a lot of debris, you know, or crossed wires, or places where their power is getting drained out. It's keeping that from being evident. And in working with them and listening to them and hearing for them what is true, like if they lock into what's true for them, I feel it now in my own nervous system. I say, wow, that felt really true for me. And if it doesn't feel true, if it feels like something somebody else told them, I mean, I might feel like I'm not even in the chair anymore, like I'm kind of floating away in the room. I say, I'm not really connecting with what you're saying. Is there something else there that you can think of? And when I feel that it's true for them, that's my guide now. And that instead of the power differential being, I'm a doctor, I'm a therapist, or I'm, you know, this person has an altitude above them, priest or whatever, and they're down here, that, you know, they should be listening to me, and if they're not, then I should dismiss them as a patient. But actually, it's not just a level playing field, but they harness the truth. And if I'm listening really well and feeling really well for what's true, then I can give them permission around that. And that ultimately is the healing journey that any of us have to go on. If we're effectually going to heal, we have to learn to listen to ourselves. And that may be hard, because it's so easy to be distracted by Facebook and TV and all these other things that dissuade us from getting real with who we are. And dropping into that space can be very scary, and it can be very almost like taking the golden path to the Wizard of Oz. I mean, all the misconceptions that that person behind the veil has the truth for us are usually bullshit. And that the truth is an experience that we have, and it's what's true for us. And everybody's so different. You cannot apply a universal formula or universal truth of healing on anybody. What works for one person, and it was totally true there, you try to apply it to the next person, and are not circumspect enough to know when it's not working, you can have a catastrophe. And that's a lot of the ways in which people have gotten into this position. You know, they trusted someone with a diploma on the wall and all their bluster and pride and their Mensa certification and white coat to know what's true for them. And there's no way somebody outside of our life can have more reality on who we are than we do. And we've been conditioned to not trust ourselves and to disempower ourselves to trust the establishment and to trust other people to tell us what's true.
I think that's what's difficult though, Lyle, and that's why I love you, your work, your center, and what you do, is that the buzzword nowadays is holistic. You know, people say, oh, we have a holistic program. But to them, a holistic program is they have yoga and they have meditation that's available. Holistic really to me means that you have a center that is open to figuring out what it's going to work to heal you individually. And that's what's kind of unique with alternative to meds, is that many, many people will get to that form, or they find you, put it that way. The Lynette's out there, many, many people, it'll be like they've tried, they don't know what to do anymore. It's pretty much that, or a psych hospital. Or it's someone who's been in multiple rehab centers and they finally are to a point where they're like, I've got to figure out what is going on. Like, how can I get a deeper level of healing? And that's what's unique. And that's part of why I usually start with the disclosure right from the start. Anybody that's on Addiction Recovery Revolution and that I do interviews with, they're not paid. And I do that intentionally because they're not paying me to do this. It's because I want it to be an unbiased platform that individuals can come. And it's not a form of advertisement, but more of an educational platform that people can come on, listen, and move on what feels right for them. Now, many, many people, I feel, especially when we're talking about mental health issues, they don't know where to go. And that's what's wonderful is you're right. You do have an inpatient facility that's there that, it's everything from mental health, psychiatric medication, because they kind of reached the end of their rope where that doesn't work. So now what do they do?
And it, within my own, I don't even know if it's a field, but within sort of the perspective that psychiatry is wrong, you sort of develop this tribal warring. And I've had to transcend that too. And this might be a bit of hypocrisy towards alternative approaches. But if taking medication is what's true for that person, then you might want to damn well respect it and give perspective. And it doesn't have to be an all or nothing thing.
Right.
For a person to be guided to the truth of their own physiology and their own healing, and to integrate all of the other places where they've been wounded and allow those things to actually integrate peacefully is a process. And
right.
If they need medications to help bridge them from one place to the next, to where they can, if you get somebody that's not sleeping and not eating and they're a complete wreck and they have been tapering their benzo for the last 2 years, what would be my suggestion is go back on a medication, maybe not a benzo, but you're going to have to sleep and you're going to have to eat in order to have healing. Your
right.
parasympathetic nervous system is when you have to get out of fight or flight. And for some people that might be CBD oil, it might be something non-pharmaceutical, but that's an individual choice. And I've had a good number of people that I've had to have a very painful conversation with. I know you've been tapering the last 2 years to get off this benzo, but the wise thing to do would be to reinstate, get some sleep, go through the detoxification process, unburden your nervous system enough, and then most often they can come off the medication without the consequences. Their nervous system is starting to regulate itself, and they don't have the ridiculously protracted withdrawal that they were experiencing before. Not always, and it's touchy ground to go down that road, because some of the other opinions out there are these blogs, and I find them to be completely toxic. representations of people's healing. When people get healed, they're not on Benzo Buddies or these other blogs really talking about what healed them. And if they are, they get kicked off. That these are kind of recycling factories for what hasn't worked for people, and it keeps people in this fight or flight and keeps them afraid to try anything.
Well, that's what integrative psychiatry is, though, and that's what I'm trying to shed light of, is that it really is just a form that's responsible. It's not negating, like you said. It's like being responsible as to all the other factors that contribute to mental health issues, and figuring out what the root is, figuring out what things will help, figuring out, but you said, like you said, it's not that you don't have a psychiatrist on your staff or that you negate it. You basically are saying there's so many other factors that are related to our mental health, whether it's people are toxic, their diets, lack of nutrient. There's so many factors that are going on, and nobody factors that in. They typically just go in, say, this is what I'm dealing with. You walk out with a prescription, but you never deal with the root of any of the issues. Like, nobody's ever dealing with the lack of nutrients that are in their body, the lack of feeding their brain. Like I said, it's ironic. Like we somehow think of the brain as being separate organ. Someone goes in and has a heart attack, and everyone says, my gosh, they've reformed, they're not eating, they're eating healthy, they're exercising. Now, if someone has a mental breakdown, nobody treats it in the same category. Nobody says, my gosh, you need to reform your diet, you need to exercise, we need to do something about that. You're just
drinking monster drinks and Pop-Tarts and expecting your brain to be
right.
Yeah.
And let's face it, most people, when they get to the point of hitting rehab with its drug addiction, alcohol, it's a mental breakdown. When you finally hit that low and you're going into a rehab center, it's a mental breakdown, but nobody treats it in the same category. We pretty much sit down and they say, guess what? You've got this issue, this issue, this issue, so you need to deal with it. But this is the responsible form that it's a form of education that doesn't occur in traditional settings. Nobody sits in a traditional setting saying, geez, you've got an exorbitant amount of anxiety going on. I don't know that anybody educates anyone and says, well, it's possible that you've got mercury poisoning or toxins that are within your body, and it could really significantly deplete your anxiety if we dealt with this. Instead, it's not dealt with on that foundation. And that's the biggest, I think, tragedy that's happening within our rehab community, is that this fundamental education doesn't exist. I mean, pretty much we just go and, you deal with the spiritual aspect, and you deal with your lack, you need more discipline in your life, and you're going to have to do these things, but nobody's dealing with it on a physical basis. And I think that's what's refreshing about when finding someone like yourself and finding centers, because oftentimes I think that people have just gone so repetitively and recycled in and out of treatment, they don't even know what to do anymore. And this aspect is never discussed.
The residential treatment field is largely, I don't want to go so far as to say a scam, because people working in those places are very well-meaning, but the end result is that you're trying to force a structure, and every good facility needs a structure and a container, but a lot of times that exact structure and that exact adherence to, well, if you just do the program, then you'll get fixed, is where it deviates from actually meeting the person. And it could be something as simple as like saying, hey, I get that you need to make a peace with your daughter that's been blaming you for
right,
and to actually energetically support that conversation and give them permission around it, so that can, there's times where you have to just really listen to what the person's showing up with. And I had a kid one time show up. We had healed him once. I mean, he went through a phenomenal transformation, literally from a psych ward to going back into college. But it's a dangerous world out there. He forgot, all those dietary stuff that we taught him. Moved in with his sister, and he collapsed again and came in maybe 9 months later. And we missed something there. We thought, well, this worked for you last time, then it's going to work for you this time. And he only wanted to eat blueberries and didn't want to do the detox shop stuff because he'd already done that. There's a whole new layer of healing that was coming up, and it had something to do with his victimization, which I won't go into, but him constraining his diet was him showing that everybody else has been making decisions for me, and this is the only thing I control. And he ended up getting discharged, and we, discharged him a couple weeks early, and just wasn't doing the program. But going back to that and just going, if I just sat with him and ate blueberries until we both pooped freaking purple, I would have made a connection with him. And he would have got sick of blueberries too, and we're like, oh, maybe I'm hungry for something else. Could have met the person where they were at. And it's that imposition of agenda and within the treatment community, there's certain agreements that are made that if you step outside of that, then you're no longer treatable by their methods. And then you invariably get told that you're wrong and invalidated and kicked out. And you might get a refund for your money, you might not, but it can be very discouraging. And it's very hard to have a facility that really treats people as an individual. You can't do it with 100 people on campus. There's a certain limitation of matter that occurs for you to be able to sit and be present with someone, and it's not scalable. You can't. It's an art. You can't turn it into some formulaic science that applies in every single situation. And it's up to each individual working in a healing facility to notice when it's appropriate for them to step outside of that agenda and expecting that if you just do the program's going to work. And
right.
In that moment, they are the healing interface. And listen, I've seen a person just break down from having their glasses broken, and just someone caring enough for them to make sure that they get a freaking little screwdriver and glue their glasses back together so they can see is miracle magic. It's like you've connected with that person, and they start to trust you. And when you have that level of trust, then you can say, hey, why don't we try this other stuff? And if they say, I don't want that, to hear it and to shift your application to things that they will do.
Well, and I think it's a progression that we all do. I went to a very traditional setting, but I sought out all of these alternative things on my own afterwards. And for me, it resonated and rung so true. And then I became so passionate about making sure that it was kind of exposed, because I feel like it's really not exposed as alternative, as forms that people can heal. And I think that the reason we have such a low percentage of people that really ever heal is because we don't deal with it on that holistic approach. And like I said, holistic is a very cliche buzzword right now, but there's very few centers out there that are doing it. Like you truly are doing it on all of those different levels. Like you said, I mean, there's all the different ones. So I admire the work that you've done, and I admire the staff that you have. I think that, obviously Sedona is a wonderful spiritual place in itself, but I mean, it's a healing center that offers people a sense of getting answers on a deeper level, on a different level, probably than most people are used to getting, on a biochemical level. I think most certainly that's probably the largest component that's missing out of most traditional settings, because like you said, most people walk in and you can always identify a treatment facility is because everyone's walking out with a Monster drink and a vape and candy of some sort. And so dealing with it on that foundation of saying, geez, statistically, you know, when you're eating like that, when you're doing that, you're not going to make it. And that's what's hard, because doing what you do, like, you already know that component is missing in so many of the centers. But it's nice because, like you said, you deal with that on all different levels. So I always appreciate you, Lyle, for taking, I mean, the last time when you were on Addiction Recovery Revolution, I asked this time, like I said, you know, I think toxins a huge contributor to anxiety, to mental health issues, and it's not ever addressed. Obviously, in your center, it's addressed in a whole different level. So if someone came to you for rehab, to either for substance abuse or for mental health issues, it's dealt with on a whole different level.
There's a certain alchemy that is applied to healing. Hippocrates was very keen to this. He would prescribe an opposite. A martial artist knows how to hurt someone by leveraging their weakness against them, and you flip somebody over that axis in order to really create a lot of force. And you can move 4,000 pounds with basically the right fulcrum. And the same thing applies to healing. If you can find where to place that fulcrum and flip a person over and alchemize their situation, then you can hit that hierarchy of healing that is in a whole different playing field than when you have someone come in and you pathologize them and you tell them, well, your addiction is wrong, your bipolar is wrong, your schizophrenia is wrong, and step back and consider just for a moment that there might be something very, very, very right about their situation, and not pathologize what's wrong for them, because then you set up that power differential where you're here, down here, and broken, and go, you know, that appetite that you have, that addiction, is remarkable. That you actually have a hunger for experience, and peak experiences, really those flow, you know, experiences that, wow, you know, society is really not set up to support that. And treat it as a gift, unveil the hidden power of their addiction, and get them in alignment with being in the flow of that and being able to access it without the toxic mimic or the bypass of drugs in the first place. You know, Robert Downey Jr. is a perfect example of someone who took a prison stint, you know, which had addiction written all over it, and leveraged it into being the highest paid actor in Hollywood.
Right.
It's the same hunger. It's the same need for peak experiences. Byron Katie, who is known in therapeutic circles for she calls it the work. It's a worksheet that people do that sort of gives a circumspect approach to how other people might be experiencing the situation. She would have been clearly diagnosed as schizophrenic had she shown up in a psychiatrist's office. She had all of the disproportionate reality, but she leveraged that into being a very, very, very powerful gift. And many of our actors, many of our CEOs would be bipolar if they were in a weakened state. And it's actually acknowledging how beautiful and remarkable that some of these gifts are that people have, and not pathologize it, but find out what's right and build on that. And the other part that's wrong, you know, you might put a magnifying glass on it at some points, but it's more in the rearview mirror, and they've tethered themselves to something that's going to empower them.
Well, Lyle, thank you. I appreciate your time. You're brilliant beyond everything that you offer the world of people that are seeking answers. I mean, you just offer so much information, and I appreciate you taking the time to speak with us again today. There'll be the links for Alternative to Meds along with the links of Lynette's story, because it's on YouTube. We'll link that with your videos so that anybody who wants to get information about your center, about your work, they're able to access that through this.
Perfect. And really just going to the Alternative to Meds YouTube channel, you can sort of pick through the longer ones are animated videos that were a huge time and money investment. I mean, about $50,000 in resource to animate, because, you know, the word salad, I'm just talking about it.
Right.
Would eclipse, you know, the scientific reality of healing would eclipse most people's understanding. Those are the more educational videos. And then the shorter ones are usually personal experiences, success stories, or just overviews. It's all good stuff, but again, it's not gospel. And it's only true enough for the majority of people for us to say this is sort of the probabilities of what the truth is. But always have to check yourself.
Right.
You know, there's medication recommendations that you know, there's disclosure that, you know, this might not be you. So
Right.
listen to that. And if it's not right for you, go to
Thank you.
Well, I also want to give another resource that you might want to add is
Okay.
the ACAM, the American College for Advancement in Medicine. Most of these doctors have gone through the curve of what it takes to really notice detox and to practice it in their practices. And the Institute for Functional Medicine, a functional medicine doctor, IFM, either one of those websites are good to find doctors in your own area that can be at least better than what else is out there.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lyle. You're wonderful.
Well, you know, we're all wonderful, and it's just a reflection of yourself.
All right. Well, we'll talk to you soon.
Ciao.
Bye.